She opened her door on the coldest night of the year and let a half-frozen stranger collapse by her fire. By morning, the town was whispering. By sunset, they were calling her a sinner. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Mary Whitmore held her palms over the hearth, as if trying to trap the last remnants of warmth slipping away with the dying flames. The night outside her modest home wasn't just wintry. It was hostile, grim, and heavy, like a memory you can't escape even under a blanket. The wooden beams creaked from the cold, and the wind clawed at the shutters, as though trying to get in and remind her that she was alone. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, but in that silence, it rang out like a bell. Mary's heart froze. No one comes on a night like this without a reason. And yet, she rose, not in fear, just with the wary alertness of a woman who's lived through too much to be afraid of people anymore. As she opened the door, she was already preparing to say, "Go away," but the words froze in her throat. A man stood before her, barely upright. His face was half hidden by a scarf, but his eyes, they looked at her with a silent anguish, a kind of scorched, inward despair that made Mary feel a strange heaviness in her chest. Not pity, but recognition. He didn't ask to come in, and she didn't offer. She simply stepped back, leaving the door open, just like in the days when the house was full of voices and the smell of baking, and when a stranger at the doorstep was not a threat, but a possible friend. When he collapsed by the hearth, not unconscious, but as if he'd let go of every last ounce of tension, Mary covered him with that same blanket, a heavy, warm one she had sewn with her own hands 20 years ago, during the first winter after her wedding. It wasn't just a gesture of care. It was an act of trust, and maybe a farewell to the past. She didn't ask who he was, didn't wonder where he came from or what he had left behind. In that moment, none of it mattered. There was only the fire, the breath, and two people too tired of being alone. Sitting in her chair, her head bowed toward the flames, Mary felt the chill inside her begin to melt. Not suddenly, not in heat, but in a warm, almost imperceptible flow. She didn't know if the man would still be there in the morning, but she knew one thing. For the first time in many months, someone was breathing in her house besides her, and that was enough to keep from burning up in loneliness. The day began with silver frost on frozen stalks and a morning wind that blew in from the east, slipping beneath collars and reminding everyone that spring was still far off. But Mary didn't shiver from the cold. She was trembling from something else, something that had settled beneath her skin, where other people's words latch on like hooks and won't let go. She stepped out, as always, just past 7, buckets of grain in her hands, the usual expectation of a silent morning in her soul. But she had barely taken a few steps across the creaky porch when she noticed the street had gone still, as if holding its breath. On the porch across the way stood her neighbor, Jenny Harper, hair tied back, squinting like she was trying to see through the dust in the air. By the store, Mr. Charles, the very man who'd offered her a sack of sugar on credit just yesterday. Now he only gave her a curt nod, his gaze quickly shifting away. That nod wasn't a greeting. It was a gesture that said, "I know." Mary lowered her head, not out of shame, but out of weariness. The stares weren't louder than words, but they hurt more. She walked down the morning road as if across a swaying plank of shame, each glance a step toward judgment. Yesterday, she was just a widow. Today, she was the talk of the town. "I saw his boots by her door," they whispered behind her back. "She said she lives with the memory of her husband. And yet—" The voice would trail off, leaving space for the imagination. "No wonder her son died young. A woman like that couldn't have been a good mother. Words born not of truth, but of the need to feel morally superior. In Dry River, people needed scapegoats, especially those who didn't ask for forgiveness, but simply went on living. Thomas had left before dawn, not leaving noise or chaos in his wake, but order. The blanket folded neatly by the hearth, a cup set gently in the drying rack, the faint scent of cedar needles lingering, like the memory of something real. And that only made them angrier. He had left quietly, but the trace he left behind was louder than a scream. Back inside, Mary approached the window without pulling back the curtain. Her face showed neither pain nor anger, only impenetrable silence. She knew, when a woman doesn't explain herself, she's judged more harshly, but she wasn't going to speak, because a truth that has to be proven is no truth at all. That Sunday morning, the church was filled with hymns, candlelight, and the scent of wax, but none of it brought warmth. Mary entered the hall as she always did, back straight in her simple gray coat, with a scarf tied the way her mother had once taught her, like a schoolgirl. She wasn't late, nor was she the first to arrive. She remained true to her habit of being invisible. But this time, invisibility had turned into emptiness. The seat next to her, where Widow Reed used to sit, remained vacant. To her left, the pew was full, but the parishioners pressed closer to one another, as if afraid that brushing against her coat might stain their souls. Even the children, who used to fidget and smile at her, now looked away, as if taught by their mothers not to look at sin. She prayed, not aloud, not with her lips, inside. And not for herself, for them, for those who, in their fear of God, had forgotten what mercy looked like. After the service, she went to the market, hoping to buy some flour and trade a pie for apples. She'd baked it herself, with cinnamon, just the way her late son had liked. The vendor, a young woman whose face once radiated kindness, took the pie, looked at it, and then set it back down. "Sorry, not taking any today," she said, avoiding Mary's eyes. Standing nearby was a man who, just a year ago, had asked Mary to pray for his dying brother. Now he turned away, as if he'd forgotten how he'd once wept on her doorstep. She took the pie back, but it burned in her hands, like proof that the warmth she had meant to share was now seen as contamination. The hardest moment came by the old fountain, when a woman passed by with her child. The girl, Haley, had once learned to read from Mary. She used to light up at each new letter, bringing Mary wildflowers she'd picked herself. When she saw Mary, Haley smiled, just like before, and took a step forward. But her mother grabbed her by the shoulder. "Not now. Let's go." Mary didn't judge. She simply watched, not the girl, the mother. Watched with a painful clarity, as if trying to remember the exact moment when, in giving birth, a woman loses her compassion. Mary had survived the loss of her husband and son, with tears, with prayer, with years. But this wasn't grief. This was something that didn't break the heart, but crushed the dignity. She returned home, not because there was nothing else to do, but because, in this town, there was no longer a place where she could simply stand. The earth was soft with thaw and threaded with the scent of rot and rebirth. Mary's knees pressed into the cold, wet soil as she set the last of the onion sets into place, fingers dirty, deliberate, steady. The act of planting, of giving something to the ground that might feed her later, had become its own kind of prayer, a defiant ritual after weeks of isolation and whispers. The ache in her joints was familiar now, almost welcome. It reminded her she was still alive, still choosing to stay. The wind shifted, carrying with it something unfamiliar. Movement. Mary's hand paused mid-reach and she looked up. There, at the edge of her field, just where the trees broke open to pasture, stood a man. She knew it was Thomas the way she'd recognize her own shadow at dusk. But he wasn't the ghost of frostbite and silence she remembered from that night. This man stood taller, shoulders squared from labor, his coat patched but clean. His beard was trimmed close now, no longer wild. In one hand he carried a sack of flour slung over his shoulder, and in the other, worn but intact, a book, Leaves of Grass, by Walt Whitman. He held it like a compass, not a gift. He didn't wave, didn't shout. He simply waited. Mary rose slowly, wiping her palms on her apron as her heart picked up speed. Not from excitement, not even from surprise, but from something deeper, something like memory before it's had time to fade. She walked toward him without hurrying. Each step sank slightly into the softened dirt, boots leaving faint prints that would vanish with the next rain. When they were close enough to speak without raising their voices, he didn't offer explanation or apology. "I owe you warmth," Thomas said quietly. His voice had changed, less strained, more certain. "And the quiet you gave me." Mary didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes flicked to the sack, then the book, then back to his face. There was no shame there, no plea, just presence. She turned without a word and walked back toward the house. At the door, she paused, glanced over her shoulder, and pushed it open wide. The wind caught the edge of it and swung it gently as she stepped aside. She didn't ask him to come in. She didn't have to. The stew simmered low and slow, filling the cabin with the kind of scent that softened walls and stitched invisible comfort between strangers. Thomas sat by the hearth, legs stretched toward the fire, a book balanced in one hand, the other wrapped around a chipped mug. His voice, quiet and steady, floated through the room as he read Whitman aloud. Verses about wide plains and weary souls, about silence and survival, and something almost like grace. Mary didn't interrupt. She sat across from him in her husband's old chair, darning a sock she no longer had any reason to mend. She wasn't listening to the words so much as to the sound beneath them. The ease that had crept into his voice. The weight that had lifted since that frozen night on her doorstep. It wasn't intimacy that passed between them, not in the way the town would later insist. It was something quieter, truer, a recognition. Two people who had been cut by the world in different places, finding that the ache hummed the same tune. They ate simply. Bread she'd baked the day before, root vegetables in broth. He complimented the stew and she snorted, amused, because it was nothing special. But when he asked for a second helping, she gave it without hesitation. Morning came early, and with it, fresh judgment. Someone, probably Mabel from across the pasture, always up before sunrise with her milk pail and her thirst for stories, had seen Thomas step off the porch, stretch in the gray light, and disappear back into the house before the rooster crowed. By noon, word had reached the steeple. By dusk, the knock came. Mary opened the door to find 3 of them, Pastor Green and 2 elders with faces carved from hard stone. They didn't ask to come in, didn't even look inside. "You're destroying what little decency remains," the pastor said, each syllable clipped like he was reciting something memorized and sour. Mary didn't flinch. She didn't lower her gaze or fumble for manners. "If decency means leaving a man to freeze to death, I want no part in it," she said, her voice like polished oak, solid, measured, with a grain of something fierce beneath. There was a silence that stretched thin, like ice about to crack. Then she closed the door. Slowly, firmly. A click echoed behind it, and though no one would admit it, the town felt the weight of that sound for days. It started with a single square, blue, the color of cornflowers Mary hadn't seen bloom in years. Her fingers remembered the rhythm before her mind could catch up. Stitch, turn. Stitch, breathe. At first, she quilted to hush the silence that crept in between meals and footsteps, a silence that even Thomas's presence couldn't completely erase. The fabric didn't ask questions. The needle didn't care who she was or what the town said. The first finished quilt was modest, soft but not intricate. She draped it over the edge of the bed one evening, not thinking much of it. The next day, Thomas took it with him to the mill. He didn't ask. He just folded it neatly, tucked it under his arm, and went off to work. By week's end, a woman named Edna knocked on the door, cheeks red from wind and hesitation. "I saw that quilt," she said, eyes not quite meeting Mary's. "It looked like it remembered things." Mary blinked, nodded once. "I have others." Edna left with one and came back with her sister. Then came 2 more. Then 4. By the second month, Mary's cabin no longer belonged to quiet. It belonged to the sound of thread pulling through fabric and chairs scooting closer to the fire. It smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, and the sharp tang of honesty. Women arrived wrapped in shawls, some with baskets, some with nothing but the ache of something they couldn't quite name. They sat on the floor, on benches, by the window. They didn't come for gossip. The town had enough of that. They came for the stillness, for the knowing looks passed without explanation, for the way Mary set out a slice of pie before a word was spoken, for the way she didn't ask about the marks on arms or the twitch in a voice when someone mentioned home. She simply handed them a needle, thread, a square of fabric. Sometimes the women talked, haltingly, then freely, of husbands who barked orders louder than necessary, of dreams pushed aside, of the way a slammed door could feel like a slap. Other times, no one spoke for hours. But always, something was stitched. A patch, a shape, a truth. Mary never preached, never comforted in the traditional sense. But her hands taught another language, one of usefulness, of patience, of putting things back together that others had torn apart. And her quilts began to speak for her. The morning of Founder's Day arrived wrapped in sunlight and lilac wind. The square bustled with wooden stalls, crepe streamers, and children darting between barrels of lemonade and hay bales stacked like makeshift forts. Laughter bounced off brick walls, and fiddles tuned lazily in the shade of the old church. It was the kind of day that made the town forget itself, its grudges, its whispers, its need to stand in judgment. But Mary Whitmore remembered. She had not attended Founder's Day in nearly a decade. Not since her husband died and silence became her chosen company. But that year, she stood in front of the mirror and wrapped the blue shawl around her shoulders. It was soft, hand-stitched by one of the younger women from her quilting circle, Cora, the baker's daughter, who once sat trembling in Mary's kitchen with a bruised wrist and shaking hands. The shawl wasn't a gift. It was an offering, a thank you, a declaration. The moment Mary stepped onto Main Street, heads turned. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to shift the air. The chatter dimmed. Mothers clutched hands a little tighter. Men stopped mid-sentence. Not out of malice, this time, but confusion, as though they hadn't expected to see her return, and certainly not like this. Her back was straight, her chin was lifted. The shawl moved with her like it belonged there. Thomas stood near the bandstand, freshly shaven, a clean white shirt tucked into dark suspenders. He didn't look at anyone but her. When she reached the edge of the square, he stepped forward. No hesitation, no scanning the crowd for permission. Just a simple gesture. His hand, open, waiting. Mary didn't pause. She placed her fingers in his and let him lead her onto the floor. The fiddles began, slow and rich, a waltz. Their steps were steady, unremarkable to any stranger's eye, but to Dry River it was thunder. For 2 full rotations there was only silence from the crowd, the kind that fills lungs with something heavier than air. Then someone clapped. A girl. Then another. The applause grew, uncertain but alive. The pastor's wife turned sharply, jaw clenched, gaze fixed on nothing. But the mayor's daughter, 18 and tender-eyed, put her hands together and didn't stop. Her cheeks were wet, her mouth trembling, but she didn't look away. Mary danced, not to defy them, but to remind herself she still could, and that, perhaps, she always had. In Dry River, long after the names of sheriffs and mayors faded from plaques and porch conversations, people still spoke of Mary Whitmore, but not with pity, not even with reverence. Her name was carried like a touchstone, quiet, solid, and warm. The young girls in town who dared to speak their minds were told, "You've got some Mary Whitmore in you." And the boys who brought shame to kind women learned to fear the silence her legacy carried. They didn't remember her for the man she sheltered, or for the scandal that nearly erased her. They remembered her for the fire, not the flames in the hearth, though those never truly died out, but for the kindling she became in the lives of others. The way she rebuilt her life, not from scraps of reputation, but from thread, from patience, from the slow defiance of staying kind in a place that punished kindness. Her home became more than shelter. It became witness, a place where pie cooled on the sill beside bruised silence, where sorrow was never rushed and dignity was stitched back into the lives of women who thought they'd lost it for good. There were those who continued to scorn her, of course. You don't undo small minds with a single act of grace. But Mary never fought them with words. Her answer was a warm plate and an open chair. Her strength lived in her refusal to be bitter, and that, more than anything, made her unforgettable. They say she and Thomas married beneath the old birch tree that leaned toward the pasture like it was listening. There was no audience, no lace or music, just wind and a few cows in the distance, and the scent of early summer in the air. He didn't kneel, he simply took her hand and said, "You were the first to see me." And Mary, who had lived through loss, shame, and a resurrection of self, looked at the man who had once shivered on her floor and whispered, "You let me be seen." No one chiseled those words into stone, but they lived, decade after decade, in the hush that fell whenever a girl in Dry River lit a fire and waited, just in case someone needed a place to be human again.